Today we're going to be reading the story of Cinderella. Can you see at the top of the book it says well-loved tales? Cinderella is another traditional fairy tale. Cinderella. I think it's already telling us they live happily ever after. Let's see. Cinderella. Once upon a time there was a young girl called Cinderella. Her mother was dead and she lived with her father and two elder sisters. Cinderella's elder sisters were beautiful and fair of face, but because they were bad-tempered and unkind, their faces grew to look ugly. They were jealous of Cinderella because she was a lovely girl, and so they were often unkind to her. The ugly sisters made Cinderella do all the work in the house. She carried coal for the fire, cooked the meals, washed the dishes, scrubbed and mended the clothes, swept the floor and dusted the furniture. She worked from morning till night without stopping. Cinderella did not only do all the housework, but she also helped her sisters to dress. She cleaned their shoes, brushed their hair, tied their ribbons and fastened their buckles. The elder sisters had many fine clothes, but they were so bad-tempered they still looked ugly. Cinderella had no fine clothes. All she had was an old grey dress and a pair of wooden shoes. In the evening, when she had worked until she was weary, Cinderella had no bed to go to. She had to sleep by the hearth, in the cinders. That's why her sisters called her Cinderella, and that was why she always looked dusty and dirty. Now it happened that the king arranged a great feast for his son. The feast was to last 3 days, and on each evening there was to be a grand ball. All the beautiful young girls in the country were invited in order that the prince might choose himself a bride. Cinderella's sisters were invited to the feast, and they were so excited that they could talk of nothing else. Cinderella was not invited, and she was only seen in rags working in the kitchen. Everyone thought she was her sister's maid. On the evening of the first ball, Cinderella had to help her sisters put on their new dresses and arrange their hair. Cinderella thought of how she would like to have a ball gown and go to the ball and see the prince, and tears began to fall down her face. "What are you crying for?" asked the ugly sisters crossly. "Well, I would like to wear a beautiful dress and go to the ball," replied Cinderella. "You go to the ball?" laughed the sisters. "A fine sight you would be at the ball." And they pointed to her ragged dress and wooden shoes. When her sisters left for the ball, poor Cinderella sat down and cried as if her heart would break. Suddenly Cinderella heard a kind voice. "What's the matter, my dear?" She jumped up from the stool and turned to see who it could be, and there stood her fairy godmother, smiling kindly at her. "Well, I would like to have a beautiful dress and be able to go to the ball," said Cinderella. "I've never been to a ball, and I've never had a ball gown, and I would love to see the prince." "And so you shall, my dear," said her fairy godmother. "Dry your eyes and then do exactly as I tell you." Cinderella dried her eyes and smiled at her godmother. "First, I want you to go into the garden and bring me the biggest pumpkin you can find," said the fairy godmother. "Very well," said Cinderella as she ran off to the garden. She picked the biggest pumpkin she could find and took it to her fairy godmother. The fairy godmother touched the pumpkin with her magic wand, and immediately it turned into the most wonderful carriage you can imagine. The outside was made of shining gold, and the inside was lined with red velvet. "Now, run and fetch me the mousetrap from the pantry," said the fairy godmother. "Very well," replied Cinderella as she ran off to the pantry. She found the mousetrap on the floor behind the pantry door. There were mice in it. Cinderella brought the mousetrap round. You see that? One magic touch of the magic wand, and the door of the mousetrap flew open, and out ran 6 mice, one after the other. Each mouse was touched by the magic wand, and it changed into a fine grey horse. 6 fine grey horses to pull the golden carriage. "Next, run and fetch me the rat trap from the cellar," said the fairy godmother. "Very well," said Cinderella as she ran down the steps to the cellar. She found the rat trap with one rat in it and took it to her godmother. One touch of the fairy wand and the rat trap flew open and the rat ran out. The fairy godmother touched the rat with her wand and it changed into a smart coachman dressed in red livery, trimmed with a gold braid. You see him? He's the coachman. Lastly, said Cinderella's godmother, I want you to run to the garden and bring me 2 lizards that are behind the cucumber frame at the bottom of the garden. Very well, said Cinderella as she ran into the garden. She looked behind the cucumber frame and there she found 2 small lizards which she brought to her fairy godmother. Cinderella's fairy godmother touched the lizards with her fairy wand. They turned into 2 smart footmen, each dressed in red livery, trimmed with gold braids to match the coachman's livery. There was now a golden coach, lined with red velvet, drawn by 6 grey horses. There was a coachman in red livery to drive the coach, 2 footmen to open the door. Cinderella glanced down at her old grey dress and her wooden shoes. One more touch of my magic wand, my dear, said the fairy godmother, and then there happened the most wonderful magic of all. Cinderella found herself in a beautiful ball gown made of pure silk. Its skirts spread wide, and there were tiny frills round the neck and down the front of the bodice. Pink rosebuds were fastened in her fair curls, and on her feet were dainty pink satin slippers. Cinderella's face was shining with joy. Oh, thank you, godmother, she cried. Thank you. Enjoy yourself at the ball, my dear, said her godmother. But there's one more thing you must remember. You must be home before the clock strikes midnight. For on the last stroke of 12, the coach will become a pumpkin again, the horses mice, the coachman a rat, the footman lizards, and you yourself the ragged girl you were. Oh, I will remember, said Cinderella, and her godmother kissed her goodbye. The footman opened the door of the carriage. Cinderella sat and spread out her skirts on the red velvet cushions. The coachman touched the horses with his whip, and off they went to the ball. When Cinderella arrived at the palace, she looked so beautiful the ugly sisters didn't know her. They thought she must have be a princess from another country. They never thought of Cinderella, for they believed that she was sitting at home by the cinders. The prince thought he had never seen such a beautiful princess. He came towards Cinderella and took her hand and danced with her. All evening he would dance with no other maiden, and he never let her out of his sight. If anyone else came to invite her to dance, the prince said, "This is my partner." Cinderella had never spent such a wonderful evening in her whole life, yet she remembered her godmother's warning. At 11:45 she left the ballroom while the other guests were still dancing. Her carriage was waiting for her and she was driven quickly home. She arrived at the door just as the clock was striking 12, and on the last stroke of midnight the coach became a pumpkin, the horses mice, the coachman a rat, and the footman lizards. Cinderella's ball gown had vanished, and she found herself once more in her old grey dress and wooden shoes. Cinderella sat down in the chimney corner to wait for her sisters. When they arrived home, they found Cinderella in her dirty clothes among the ashes and a dim little oil lamp burning on the mantelpiece. The ugly sisters could talk about nothing but the beautiful princess, who looked lovelier than any lady at the ball. They described her gown, her slippers. They spoke of how the prince had danced with her all evening and how he would not permit no other man to dance with her, yet no one knew who she was. Cinderella listened to this but said nothing. On the next evening, the ugly sisters went off to the second ball, leaving Cinderella sitting by the fire. No sooner had they gone than Cinderella's godmother appeared again. Just as before, her magic wand produced a golden carriage with its coach and footman. This time Cinderella's ball gown was even more beautiful than on the first evening. It was made of pale blue satin with floating overskirts of pale blue net embroidered with silver thread. Her pale blue slippers were embroidered in silver, and her silver stars sparkled in her hair. Once more Cinderella thanked her godmother, who reminded her to be home in time for midnight. When Cinderella arrived at the ball, all in blue, everyone was astonished at her beauty. The king's son had waited until she came, and he instantly took her by the hand and danced with no one else. When others came and invited her to dance, he said, "This is my partner." Cinderella was so happy she almost forgot what her godmother had told her. She left the prince and hurried out of the ballroom as quickly as she could. Cinderella's cage was waiting for her, and they set off at speed, but they were only halfway home when the clock struck 12. On the last stroke of midnight, the carriage, the horses, the coachman and the footmen vanished, and Cinderella found herself in her old grey dress and wooden shoes in the middle of the dark road. She had to run the rest of the way home as fast as she could. Even so, she had just seated herself on the stool by the cinders when her sisters returned home from the ball. On the evening of the third ball, Cinderella's fairy godmother appeared as soon as the ugly sisters had left. But when her godmother had touched her with the magic wand, Cinderella found herself in a gown which was more splendid and magnificent than ever. It was made of silver and gold. Diamonds sparkled at her throat, and her hair was held high by a dazzling diamond tiara. Enjoy yourself, my dear, but don't forget the time. When Cinderella arrived at the ball, her dress of silver and gold looked magnificent. "This is my partner," the prince said. Suddenly the clock began to strike 12. Cinderella was terrified she would find herself in the ballroom in her grey dress, and rushed out of the door and left her glass slipper. The prince ran after her and saw the slipper. He picked it up and saw it was small and dainty and golden. By the time Cinderella reached the place where her carriage had been, it had disappeared. The prince looked everywhere for her. He didn't know her name, but he'd fallen in love with her and he wanted to marry her. So the next morning the prince took the golden slipper to his father, the king, and said, "No one shall be my wife but she whose foot that this slipper fits." The king's herald was sent through the streets of the city, carrying the small golden slipper on a blue cushion. The prince found himself followed the herald, hoping to find the lady with whom he danced. At last, the herald followed the prince, and they came to Cinderella's house. Each of the ugly slippers were determined to squeeze their feet, look how big their feet are, into the tiny slipper, so she could marry the prince. But they both had large, ugly feet, and even though they struggled until their feet were bleeding, neither one could force her foot into the slipper. At last the prince turned to Cinderella's father. "Have you no other daughter?" "Well, I have one more," replied the other father, "but she's always in the kitchen. She's much too dirty. She cannot show herself." But the prince insisted. Cinderella first washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed down before the prince, who gave her the golden shoe. She seated herself on her stool, drew her foot out of her heavy wooden shoe, and put on the slipper, which fit like a glove. When Cinderella stood up, the prince looked at her face. He knew it was the beautiful maiden who had danced with him, and he cried out, "This is my true bride." At that moment, Cinderella's fairy godmother appeared and turned her once more into a beautiful princess. The old grey dress became a velvet gown. The prince lifted Cinderella onto his horse and rode away with her. The two ugly sisters were horrified to discover that Cinderella was the beautiful princess who'd been at 3 balls. They were so angry they went pale with rage. At the palace, the king was glad to welcome his son's bride. He arranged a magnificent wedding for the prince and Cinderella. All the kings and queens and princesses and princes in the land came to the wedding, and the wedding feast lasted a whole week. And so Cinderella and the prince lived happily ever after.